I must say. Uh, Sir, the today's talk is based on the theme of his special lecture, The Politics of Cultural Transformation on the Kullu Frontier, approximately 1800 to 2000 AD. Without taking more time, I once again invite Dr. Arik for his special talk, and I also request to our participants to share their queries and question in chat box, which will be taken after the lecture. Sir, please, you may start your presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shweta Kandari. Thank you, Madam Vice Chancellor, Professor Nautial. Thank you, all the staff and faculty in Srinagar University, and Dr. Ashok Jain for the opening remarks. I'm very happy to be here. I hope, can you hear me okay? Yes. I assume so. Just if I may ask whoever is the administrator to mute for the duration of the lecture, if you could mute the microphones and leave me open, that would help, I think, with background noises. So if you could mute all other participants, that would be wonderful. Also, I would like to, okay, just a few words. When I was asked to, or posed to give this lecture, I was a little timid because I work obviously on the Himalayan societies and the modern history of Asia, and primarily up in the hills. So I wasn't sure what I'd have to contribute to the Mahatma's 150th birthday. Nevertheless, I made a certain effort, and I'm very glad for the opening remarks by both Madam Vice Chancellor and Dr. Ashok Jain that actually covered several aspects that we'll be discussing in this particular talk, which is based on my recent research. So if I may share screen with you, I think that's possible, right? Yes.
Yes, Arik.
Okay, so here we go. What I would like to discuss today is about is a study of cultural transformation, and specifically the place of ritual in politics. From the Himalayan valley of Kulu in Himachal Pradesh, I've corrected the time frame to roughly 1850 to 2000, and let me hold on. Here we go. Yes. And I think that'll become clear as we discuss the matters at hand. But the outline I'll be working in is 3 phases. We'll talk about some background and definitions, bringing us into the idea of ritual and culture as a mobilizing force in Gandhian politics, then about the various ritual phases of Himalayan political cultures. And by ritual cultures, I refer to both the popular Devta cult and the royal cults found throughout this part of the Himalayas, this Garhwal and Himachal and the border areas between them. Then we'll delve a little deeper into what happens in Kulu and try to make sense of the Kulu Valley's political landscape by distinguishing between 2 of the dominant forces historically in the modern history of this area, that is the royal cult of Raghunath and the popular cult of Jamnu or Jamadagni Rishi in Malana. And finally, after having these foundations laid, I'll try to explain how we can, in areas with very few written sources, interpret history by looking at ritual changes. I'll look at a specific ritual that some of you, like Dr. Smita Sagal, I think, already are familiar with, the Kaika Mela, and then look at these ritual changes as an index of political change. So kindly bear with me. There's some work ahead of us. Let's start with Gandhi. So Gandhi was a practical idealist who used culture for political mobilization. And by this I mean elements that Madam Vice Chancellor has pointed out nicely, the use of Ramrajya, the promise of Ramrajya, the ascetic attire, using these familiar tropes, as Shahid Amin had shown in his paper of 1989 on Gandhi as Mahatma, from the events in Chowri Chowra. The interpretation of Gandhi by the masses was made easy by relying on these popular or familiar tropes of South Asian culture. Another aspect in which Gandhi made use of culture was by ritualizing these quotidian tasks, right? Tasks such as the chakra, the charka, the spinning activities, even the salt march, the making of salt. So the idea is to take trivial kind of activities and turn them into rituals. So this is another way in which political mobilization was made possible. And as Ashish Nandia explained in his seminal Intimate Enemy book from 1983, this embrace of Indian culture had both a psychological effect of empowering the masses, right? Empowering the participants in the movement for independence, and also making them active participants in generating political change. So what I mean to say is that we draw on the tools, and Gandhi was basically drawing on familiar tools in order to generate change, and I'll try to show how this kind of thing can happen, or has happened and continues to happen in the Western Himalaya in India and in Himachal Pradesh, just across the border. To do this, we'll have to take a few notes about how we can define, research-wise, the political cultures of the region. And there are two ways that we can define them. We can look at the popular level, the village level, which is the religious cults, devtas, the Devta Karaj, the government by deity, where we have the local village gods act as kings, and each little village becomes a kingdom of sorts with its own set of administrators. We'll talk more about this in a minute. And then on top of this, or parallel to this, a lot of the times, we will have Rajput kingdoms, right? And ritual cults associated with Rajput powers, such as Garhwal, and as we were mentioning, the procession to Badrinath, exactly the same kind of structure with variances can be found throughout this part of the world. The photos below are from the Kulu Valley. We'll see more of these as we progress. Right, so the important thing about Devta Karaj, this popular level of religion, is to understand that it is a civic religion. And civic religion, by this I mean that we have a social life that is regulated by ritual protocols. The Devta is the supreme ruler and represents the political will of the community. And this is done by the participation of most, ideally all, members of the said community. And this includes the Kardar, the head of the village, the dominant, politically dominant lineage in the village, the shaman, Mali or Gur, who speaks for the deity, the pujari, the Rohit, the priest, and of course committees of Devtalog, which we call them, that is Bhandari, the people who take care of storage of taxes and so forth. Now, because all of these activities are religiously sanctioned, what we have in village life is effectively a civic religion of the type described also for Tibetan societies by Charles Rambo in Mustang, in the enclave of Te in Upper Mustang. And what we mean by this is that we have a close-knit community that subscribes to a certain religious set of rules and practices that actually have a very strong social basis and a strong fundamental role in regulating citizenship, so to speak, on a very local level. So this is just one of the examples of the devtas in Kulu, which are familiar to you, and you're coming from Garhwal, of course, the Rath or Palki, on which we carry the deity, the Mohras, the murtis, the faces, right, that represent the deity, and all these are come out in festive occasions. Otherwise, the deity will be in the storehouse or in the temple. Now, because we have multiple communities like this, then we have relationships between devtas and with the devtas being regulated in various means. So the relations between the devtas are ritually enacted. That is, devtas will visit each other, will have quarrels with each other, and so forth. But we also have a situation where, for example, in remote areas, an imperial cult or a grassroots empire, we could call it, of devtas controlling or purporting to control a larger swath of territory develops. And a good example of this is the Devta Mahasu in Chansar Bavar on the border with Himachal in Uttarakhand, an area known as previously Mahasu Desh, which encompassed actually the Shimla Hills and Chansar Bavar and perhaps other parts closer to Rampur Bishar to the north. And the idea is that we have one strong community and a central cult that controls other local devtas. Now, in areas that are more favorable to the centralization of political power, along the Indo-Tibet trade routes of the Sutlej River, for example, in Rampur Bishar, or in Kulu, where we have a wide valley, then in these areas, the Devta communities often came under human Rajput rulers. And good examples, yes, Ramkul Bashan, Garhwal as well, Kullu, each one for its own reasons. Here we have, again, an assembly of several Devtas demonstrating the relationship between the Devtas as a social event, effectively a relationship between communities. Right. Now, specifically in Kulu, what we have is an area where Devta rule, that is village communities, but also powerful local Devtas that control several other communities or purport to control, and the Rajput rule of human rulers overlap. So I think you can see this. This is, well, you're all familiar with where we're discussing, and this is a map of Himachal Pradesh, the districts within it. We're discussing the district of Kulu. Okay, so having laid this ground base for what I'd like to do, I'd like to make a little more sense of the Kulu political landscape at this point. Okay, so let's first understand what this valley is about. Kulu is a fairly, till recently, remote valley. It's late 80s, a very important tourist destination in India. Less so under COVID, I imagine. But if we look at this area that is very picturesque, very kind of scenic, and at the same time very remote, we can see that it lies on the boundary of Lahore and Spiti, and that essentially it has three basic groups, culturally and historically distinct groups. The first one is the indigenous or autochthonous substratum of Devta kingdoms, what I've just described and what we've seen photos of. So these are villages with communities that are either there for generations or have traveled from other areas within the hills and married into that particular place. And there we have the Devta kingdom. On the other hand, we have the intimate others, the immediate, supposedly alien groups from Tibetan societies in Lahore and Spiti. And thirdly, we have migrants from the plains, Punjabis, Rajputs, etc. And Guru Gobind Singh has been visited Kulu. I mean, these are, not that the area was a complete cultural isolate, but if we look at it, we have these three general groups interacting and settling there in different layers at different historical moments. So the question is, if we have such an incongruence between such three central components, can we even speak about Kulu society as a cultural home? And the answer is, fortunately, that we can if we look at ritual politics. So Kulu society, despite its disparity, can be considered unity. If we look at ritual politics in the sense that we have a Rajput unification of all the Kulu villages, all the Devtas, in the 17th century, allegedly in 1661. And this unification of the Devtas is remembered and enacted through ritual. Unification happens under Raja Jagat Singh, who brought a chosen deity from Ayodhya, Raghunathji. And Raghunathji is the master of the Dashara or Dussehra celebrations that happen every year. The Kulu Dashara, of course, is very, very famous now across the world. But the idea was that all the Devtas in the valley were meant to submit and participate in this, and by participating in the Dashara, they demonstrate and reify the authority of Raghunath. They are subservient, they come to visit the great lord of the valley. And by this we have a parallel system of rule in which the Devtas, which represent the collective political will of villages, in essence demonstrate the subservience of the villagers to the Raja. So there's a theistic, deity level politics, and then we have what it actually means in terms of social and political alliances. Now, the ritual enactment and the stories associated with it, the myths that you'll find in various places, they actually have just long-term historical processes that explain how a certain dynasty came to power and secured it by coming into an alliance with Ramanandi Bhaktas, with members of the Ramanandi Bhakti movement in northern India. I'm not going into this now, but the idea is that we can actually analyze and dissect these stories by looking at the ritual components and the story components, narrative components, and crossing them with other sources to arrive at a more probable and informed understanding of how Raghunath became the king of the gods. So ritual politics will actually help us both explain the unity of Kulu society and bring us back into the idea of historicizing such processes. But we might want to ask also, what about the relation between the Rajput rulers and other powerful local deities? So here we find an interesting example. The hermit village of Malana, very famous to us as well these days. The hermit village of Malana is located at the periphery of Kulu, right, you could say, at the tipping point, at the high altitude glen on the northeastern parts of the valley, which borders Spiti and Lahore, Tibetan society, right? So this hermit village actually contests Kulu state and authority. It's like an empire unto its own. And the deity that controls this area is called Jamnu, the deity Jamnu, and is still considered the most powerful of the Kulu gods, as he was in 1956 when Colin Rossler, one of the founders and pioneers of Himalayan studies, had a long career in Kathmandu later, wrote his ethnography. He spent time there in the 50s, and what he describes was apparently true for about at least 100 years before, and we'll try to explain why. But the question is, how does one devta in a very distant kind of area contest state authority, Rajput or modern state? And this happens in two ways. One, Jamnu, the deity, avoids participating in Dashara, which means he doesn't submit to the rule of Raghunath, and by extension, the people of Malana, the followers of Jamnu, do not submit to the authority of the kings, today politicians, of course. Second is we have evidence, and this continues today, of raiding parties from Malana, collecting taxes from various villages within Kulu, in the valley below them, ostensibly villages that are supposed to be under the control of the Kulu king, but in fact have muwafti, that is tax-free land grants, that are meant to be directed to Jammu. Okay. So what we have is an interesting situation where we have an external peripheral force that contests state authority through a strategy of cultural exclusion, which Richard Appleby has shown this nicely in an article in 2015. This strategy of cultural exclusion actually extends today in the kind of demeanor and activities that the people of Malana pursue, such as being world-class exporters of charas, or marijuana-induced items that are sold on a global scale. And this notion of being so different from their environment feeds into Malana culture, and also feeds into their economic viability and success in an area that is otherwise not very useful for gaining income. As a result of this strategy of cultural exclusion, though, Malana and Kulu societies become closely intertwined. Okay. So what do I mean by this? I mean that even the myths told locally, because the villagers in Kulu consider Jammu to be the most powerful of the Kulu gods to this very day. And many of them claim that actually the running myth is that Jammu came from far away from the Tibetan side of the hills and was sat on top of a mountain pass when he was hurled a rock at by the local villagers, and the casket, the kardu that he had, broke open, carrying his casket with him, broke open. And Karakardu, the numerous Naga deities and the numerous local gods had actually established themselves in the valley, originating from Jammu Rishi himself. Okay? But there's also, as apart from the mythic aspect, there's also a ritual aspect that demonstrates this enmeshment of the two societies very well. And this is in a memoir that says a master's thesis by Suzanne Rigaud, submitted in Paris a couple of years back, where she analyzes the main festival in Malana. And the main festival means this is a regional festival, and much like Dashara, where the local deities and the local villagers would come to the capital of Kulu, the Rajput capital, here we find villagers coming up to Malana to pay obeisance to Jammu and ask for all kinds of special requests. So what we have, in fact, is a unique kind of double two sources of political authority, if you like, to which Kulu folk can turn. So the question is, how do we explain when this kind of enmeshment originated and how it happened? Before we go to that, I'll just like to give you here a quick look at, this is the Kulu Valley. If you follow my cursor here, little arrow, these are the boundaries of the Kulu Valley, more or less, and these are more or less the boundaries of the kingdom, of the erstwhile Rajput kingdom. Capital here in Kulu. The Bias River runs all the way down through the main valley and into the adjoining Rajput kingdom in Mandi, where it leads out to Kangra. And this is Kulu, and this is Malana. Okay. So Malana is really up here, and we have Spiti on the east here, and Lahore on the north, already other societies, different completely. Now, voice is not clear. Is this better? This might be right. Okay, apologies for the technical inconvenience. Again, I'll just repeat myself for those of you who couldn't hear this. We are looking at a map of the Kulu region, the kingdom of Kulu that we've discussed a minute ago. And what I'd like you to note is this relative isolation of this area, the center of political authority in the town of Kulu, right, formerly a Nagar. Oh, sorry. And how the main village life is concentrated across and down this valley, but Malana, funnily enough, in this disadvantaged position of a high altitude glen, manages to assert authority as well. And the question is, can we contextualize the relationship between these two powers, especially given the fact that Malana is an area that does not, that has supposedly its own dialect, that remains aloof and does not have any written records of its past, in comparison with Kulu, where we had a Rajput dynasty. So the answer is yes. We can historicize the relationships between Kulu and Malana by analyzing changes in ritual form, and I'll discuss this in detail in the last part of the talk. But before that, I'd just like to give a few words about the kind of historical sources that we have. These are very easy to comprehend. We have the classical kind of sources, epigraphic sources, in which we have nothing written from the period of Malana. But we do have the written sources, the dynastic rolls, the Vamshavalis of the Kulu kings. We have British reports and gazetteers. The British arrived in the area in 1845, as rulers, that is. And we have, of course, the HP government reports. Again, taking into account the idea of technical problems, please follow the text, which should help you follow the content of my lecture. So again, my argument is that we can't historicize the relationship between Malana and Kulu. Malana, despite being a largely oral society where everything, tradition is passed and transmitted orally, and having very little written records until the modern period, we can nonetheless understand this if we look at changes in ritual form. The precise ritual forms and changes I'll discuss in a minute, but before that I'd like to talk about the sources that we can use. And the written sources that we actually have for this area in this modern history period are three types: dynastic rolls from Vamshavalis of Kulu kings, British reports and gazetteers, and Himachal Pradesh government reports. All of these sources are written from the state perspective. Okay, so if we look at Malana as a non-state actor, then we have nothing to look at, but we have state perspective written sources. The written evidence about Malana, as I note here, is limited to the reports and gazetteers. There's nothing written about Malana in the Vamshavali, to the best of my knowledge, and also to ethnographies and scholarly works. These are really, look at four main ones, and these are the articles I mentioned by Richard Axelby and Suzanne Rigaud, Colin Rosser's thesis and other writings, and Topland's close work in Greek. So what I would like to propose in the final part of this lecture is a way to understand Malana history, and we find that if we analyze changes in rituals that are connected with Malana, they are actually instructive of historical changes. Okay, so historicizing ritual transformation, this is the heart, I would say, of the argument I'd like to present. And we have here a two-phase inquiry. First, I would like to present a ritual known as the Tatika, a religious festival, and how it was celebrated between 1880 and 2000. And I will outline ritual change, the way this ritual was celebrated, and then try to explain why this change, I think, had happened and how. So the Tatika Mela, when we look at it today, is considered the most potent purification rite in the Kulu Valley. And we're looking at a ritual spectacle held irregularly, once every few years, in villages throughout Kulu and also in northern Mandi. Now, the fact that this is the most important rite is reflected in the fact that it is concluded with a Norwali, with a human sacrifice of sorts, or an approximation of it, in which the ritual specialist swallows poison or is shot. There is various ways that this is done, but ultimately is revived. And I'll explain a bit about this in a minute. Now, the Tatika Mela goals are soteriological, expiation, people come there to be absolved of sin, and political. That is, the community that hosts this festival will assert political dominance by displaying their monopoly over violence. That is, they will be executing the person who came to perform the ritual. And this classical anthropological thought of me translates into a way to assert dominance, political dominance. Now, the ritual specialists that perform this are an OBC, another backwards class according to classical classifications in modern India, called the Nar. And I'll just discuss the Nars briefly. Come from a group that has this liminal position, and they actually act as Acharaj Brahmins or Mahabrahmins, funerary specialists. So they carry the wooden funerary rites, and I think part of this capacity to deal with polluting substances related to death is hold on. Is this better? I'm afraid there's very little I can do in terms of perhaps. Okay. So, right, so I'll proceed. I'll just go through this slide very quickly. Thank you for your patience here. We're looking at the most important ritual spectacle in Kulu, the Tatika Mela. And it is the most important purification rite held irregularly in the heart of the monsoon seasons. And it's an occasion where one village will host a Mela, and many other villages will join. And recall that the villages have their own deities, their own devtas, and this means that when they join, they bring their devtas with them. Now, that this is an important rite is reflected in the fact that the Tatika Mela concludes with the execution or the sacrifice of the ritual specialist, who is then revived. Okay? And in this way, it achieves two goals. One is to expiate sin. Participants come there to be absolved of sin, to get rid of Babdosh. And political, to assert dominance by displaying the monopoly over violence of the sacrificers, that is, the people who have invited their guests to the local village that hosts the Mela. And the ritual specialists themselves are uniquely equipped to deal with these materials, these polluting substances that are expiated, because they come from a community of death ritual specialists, or Mahabrahmins, Acharaj Brahmins, that is, funerary priests. Okay, so a lot of this ritual has been described in this film, Chidra, which I'd co-created with Nadal Varel. And I'll show you a couple of photos from this, and I'll explain the three stages of the Tatika very quickly. The first is the Taika Karerna. We construct this canopy seen here. The host villagers will cut the branches early in the morning, bring them down in the evening before that. The ritual specialists will arrive and be greeted as guests, as honorary guests in the village. They will sanctify the ritual ground, and this canopy called Tatika will be raised. And this is where all the expiation activity takes place for the next few days of the ritual. In stage 2, we actually perform several rounds of Chidra Yajna, what they call, yes, or Chidra. And Chidra, the hole or the perforation, is a common ritual procedure that expiates sin by diverting it to a ritual device. So what we have here, this is the Nor, this is the ritual specialist, Ramnath, and he is, this is the device where you see the grains, where all the pap and dosh, all the polluting substances are stored. And of course, the Nords, when they arrive as a couple. So it's a married couple. We have both Ramnath and his wife, Keki Devi, we'll see her in a minute, and she sits by him throughout the stage of yajnas. And people will come for private chidras like this, or they will come for public rounds of chidra. That is, the entire community will come to join them, aided by the shamans or the gurus, or Mali, I think in some parts in Garhwal they're called, but the spokespersons for the deities, here in white. And they will perform again these chidras. Here we see Ramnath. They will perform these procedures to get rid of the various sins. Here we see the village Kardar on the left, the leader of the community that's hosting this entire village. So after a few days of this, and we have a few rounds of these chidras as per the number of deities that have arrived. You can see the deities up here. After this, we will have stage 3, which is the Norwali. And this is when the headman, the same person seen here, will execute the knot. This is done here through a bow and arrow charged with special mantras. And then the body of the knot, covered in cloth, as you would take a kadav, as you would take a dead person, is brought back to the ritual grounds where we perform the Chibrayachas, and his wife or partner will perform the Chidra over his body. The knot revives, and the couple leave with a lot of gifts and payment. So on the face of it, when we look at this, what I call the Norwali Kaskamela, this ritual I just described, we are looking at what James Fraser had described as a scapegoat ritual. Scapegoat ritual, right? The person, we have a receptacle for our sins. It could be a goat that we send out to the wilderness, or it could be a human person sacrifice, with a certain twist, in the sense that ultimately all the bad karmatic kind of charge is transferred from the body of the ritual specialist to the host deity by the wife performing chidra over the body. So it's a classical scapegoat in the sense that we transfer sins from one place to the other. But historical sources will give us a slightly different understanding of this. And here Malana comes into play. It turns out that the earliest record of Haifa, not called Haifa but Haifa, describes, again, a girl, a pre-pubescent girl, before menstruation, who marries the god king Jamlu in Malana. And this is from Rose's compendium of tribes and castes in the northwestern frontier and the Punjab of 1919, but it relies on materials collected from roughly 1870 to 1919. So almost a 50-year time span when we know that this kind of ritual in which a little girl would be wed to the god king of Malana, a girl specifically of the Naran caste, and that in this way she would purify him. This ritual was already happening and it was called Kaika. Okay. Importantly, all this young girl had to do was to marry the god king. She had no obligations. She needed to perform nothing, and she would be treated as an honorary guest or a goddess whenever she came to the village. So what we have here basically is something very similar to what we are familiar with from other places in India, and very much so in Kathmandu in Nepal, the Kumari cult, right? The idea of a young child who is married to a deity or to the deity that represents a political entity, and this way purifies the deity. And that this role expires when the Naran reaches puberty, at which point she is replaced by another one. Now, the structural similarities, which are numerous, between the Norwali Kaika and this divine wedding or Kumari-like Kaika suggest that the Norwali is actually an elaboration of the Malana version, of this earlier Malana version. Okay? In both versions, we need people in this particular community to perform purification. But what we have in this modern version of the Norwali is we have an added element that gives us this very strong political element of asserting political autonomy or independence. By what? By displaying again our monopoly over violence in the killing of the ritual specialists, which does not happen in the anterior version. So here's this map again, just to show you. Recall Malana is here. The blue dots around here are places where Kaika Melas are held today. There's actually a few more that I've discovered since. So all of these places are villages where Kaika Melas occur. In Malana, mind you, for the past 30 years or so, there have been no Kaikas. But so places that occur or used to occur. And it's important to note this and to kind of see the spread of this what began as an isolated ritual by the 1910s is actually spreading from Hurang in Mandi territory already throughout the hills here. Okay, so how did this transformation from a divine wedding, from a Kumari cult into a Norwali happen? Let's try to historicize and contextualize this. According to the British sources that we have, from the 1870s to the 1900s or 1910s, we have the Kumari Kaika Mela in Malana. But from the 1910s until the present, the Norwali Kaika Mela, where we have a much more elaborate kind of ritual spectacle happening that concludes with a human sacrifice, has spread far and wide beyond Malana. Now, what I would argue is that this particular kind of transformation can be explained if we look at wider economic and political changes from the time the British arrived, more or less. Politically, the main thing that happened was that the Rajas of Kulu, the Rajput rulers, became liberated. Okay, they were removed, and as a result, the villagers were liberated. So they were removed to the valley of Parvati, to the eastern valley, if I can show you this. The Rajas who used to rule over this entire area were now moved only to this area. So all of these villages became independent. A second thing that happened, economically is that we have grazing and transhumance becoming much more important and much more lucrative under the British. Why is this so? This is because the Rajas can no longer tax all the sheep, and villagers who control certain areas can take taxes from visiting, migrating Bujals and other groups who come to rear their flocks and tend to them up in the highlands. So this, for Malana, which is situated up here, is of course a huge economic advantage, but for the Rajas less so, because they lose all the taxes that they could take before. So what happens as a result of this? My hypothesis is that the Kulu villages had emulated the former Rajas' rivals, the Malanese, to display their own autonomy. The Kaika Mela, because this is the village, and I'm talking about the original Kaika Mela, right? The one where we have a marriage of a Naran girl to Jamnu, the god king. The Kaika Mela secures Jamnu's purity and is therefore the most important element in Malana society. By borrowing and adapting the Kaika Mela, Kulu villages would affiliate with the counter-Rajput element, okay, with an element that is most clearly anti-kingly establishment, which means effectively assert their independence. The ritual specialists themselves, the Nas, realized this potential and peddled the Kaika Mela to new patrons. They had new people who would now pay for a Kaika Mela in their own area, and elaborated the rite by introducing Norwali. So instead of just sending a girl to marry the god king, what was probably a very local affair, it seemed, between one community and Manikaran, we allow more Nars to participate, we find more income, we bring in couples, and we create a situation where the original purpose is still performed, there's still the purification happening, but we also have a more spectacle kind of a more way that is format that is more publicly appealing, more assertive of political independence. Now, how this evolution exactly happened is unclear. We know that the Naras have close relations with the Nas, who the householder Nas yogis in Kulu, who also are reputed as magicians, or at least originate some kind of magicians. Maybe that's how this happened. We don't have any written sources at present to explain this. But I think that given the very clear evolution of one form of ritual to the other, there was some kind of tinkering here on the part of the Nas that realized the potential of these new villages, the new liberation of these villages, that found a new way to showcase their wealth. And this is actually increasing as Kulu becomes more and more prosperous. So to conclude, and to open the floor to questions, which I hope there are, we started with Gandhi because this is, after all, the 150th birthday of Gandhiji. So when we saw that he would recast a familiar cultural trope or idea or form in order to secure political mobilization. And we also saw that rituals and local culture in Kulu, for example, was expressed through specific rituals that were both specific to religious cults, either at the Rajput level, at the level of the state, or at the level of the Devtas, and that these can be historicized in various ways. In the Kaika Melaship, from this Kumari to Norwali, yes, from the divine wedding to the human sacrifice, once we've established this transformation in the ritual, we can try linking it on the basis of the other sources that we have to the political and economic changes introduced since the British took over, and of course since 1947 after independence. And therefore, I would like to propose that the linkage of ritual and politics, which was so amply deployed by Gandhi, may be linked to a deeper, perhaps universal undercurrent in human behavior. And I thank you very much.
Internet connectivity.